Snow fell without a sound, thick white clumps pounding the ground like heavy blankets, burying every trace of life. The trees curled inwards, lost in the freezing mist. The dirt path leading down into the valley had disappeared under nearly a handspan of ice, and even the sky seemed to fade, as if it had forgotten there had once been sun, once been color. There was no scent of spring wind, no warmth of firelight, no echo of human voices from some distant home. Only one thing remained in this world: the cold, spreading, invading, sinking deep and saturating every muscle fiber, every cell, every fading breath. Ghost couldn't remember when it began. He didn't know how far he'd gone, or what he'd left behind. Forest, kennel, or some forgotten iron cage. His left back leg had gone numb, dragging through the snow like a rotting piece of timber. His throat was dry and burning, but he couldn't make a sound. His breath was so faint, even he wasn't sure he was still alive, or already part of the blizzard that surrounded him. Snow clung to his fur, frozen into clumps heavy as stone. Every step was a struggle. But Ghost kept moving, driven by an instinct older than fear itself: survive. He had been taught to endure the whip, the chain, the inexplicable pain. Every time he fought back, the beatings doubled. Every bark meant a day without food. Gradually, Ghost stopped resisting. He learned to shrink into himself, to hold his breath when footsteps approached, to stay still as grass when the training lights flicked on at night. His once amber eyes, clear as polished stone, had dulled, not from damage but from losing any reason to shine. But today, in the storm, there was a different scent. Not fear, not violence, not the stench of leather grips or scorched rubber from the training ground. This smell was old wood, cold engine oil, and a trace of expired dried meat, all wrapped in the faintest warmth, like the sigh of someone who's lived alone for too long. Ghost stopped. His heavy head dropped, then lifted again with effort. In front of him stood a low, crooked wooden fence, warped from decades of winter. Beyond it, blurred by the gray snow and shadows, a beam of light moved, slowly, cautiously, with no yelling, no whistling, no threats. A flashlight, weak but strangely warm, like a signal lost in a world where every other light had gone out. Someone was coming. A tall figure, shoulders hunched, moved like every joint had been robbed of ease by war. The man had no leash, didn't call out, didn't extend a hand too quickly as if afraid the dog might bolt. He simply stood there, a few steps from Ghost, then slowly knelt, knees pressing into the snow with a soft puff, and placed a rough, oil-stained hand on the frozen ground between them. Ghost didn't know what the man wanted, but he saw how the man looked at him, not staring, not pitying, but as if seeing right through to the broken parts inside. No one had ever looked at him that way. Not like a broken tool, not like an experiment, not like something that existed only to obey. In that gaze, for a brief moment, was something Ghost hadn't felt in ages: recognition. He had no strength to growl, no whine, no retreat. His body was nearly frozen, his mind blurred like tree shadows behind snowfall. But Ghost still blinked, a tiny motion, almost absurd in its smallness, yet enough to shatter the last layer of ice between two worlds. The man nodded slightly. Without a word, he reached forward, slid both arms under the dog's belly, and lifted him, not forcefully, but with quiet resolve. Ghost didn't resist, didn't struggle. In that embrace was no imprisonment, only something nameless, yet warmer than any blanket he'd ever known. When the truck door slammed shut behind them, the noise didn't startle Ghost. He was laid gently on the passenger seat, wrapped in a faded yellow wool blanket that smelled of thyme and maybe joint spray. The engine hummed to life, dashboard lights flickered, and the heater hissed softly. Walter said nothing. He just drove, slowly, like he knew he was carrying something fragile on the edge of vanishing. Outside, snow still fell in thick sheets, but inside the truck, there was a quiet warmth, like the deep breath after long pain. Ghost closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but because, in the faint glow of the dashboard, beside this man, for the first time in all those nameless days, he felt he still had a right to peace. And if this was the final stop, he felt no regret. But if not, maybe life had just begun again. If there was one thing Walter Hayes had never imagined doing at 61, it was cradling a half-dead dog into his truck on a night thick with snow, driving down a mountain with trembling hands and a back soaked in sweat. But as he glanced over at the passenger seat, where a motionless shepherd lay under a worn-out wool blanket, each breath escaping as a thin trail of fog from his quivering mouth, he knew it, deep down. He had no regrets. The truck slid through slick curves, headlights lighting up the icy road, reflecting shards of light like broken glass. Walter didn't drive fast, but his eyes were locked on each snow-slick bend, hands gripping the wheel like he was carrying in that cab everything left of a shattered youth. Beside him, Ghost made no sound, didn't move. Walter wasn't even sure he was conscious, but his warmth, however faint, was real, slipping through the cracks in Walter's heart, cracks that had long gone dry after war, after the death of his first wife, after that final phone call from a daughter he hadn't dared to call back. Walter didn't ask, "What breed are you?" or worry, "Do you bite?" He didn't care if the dog was diseased, dying, or maybe not worth saving. He had lived long enough to know, sometimes reason doesn't matter as much as the choice, and tonight's choice wasn't about saving an animal. It was about refusing to let it die alone. Walter had seen death more times than he'd ever hugged another human. He'd held bleeding comrades in his arms, dragged bodies through trenches under fire, buried his first dog, a Labrador named Scout, with his bare hands because he had no shovel on the mountain. He knew the cold of endings. He also knew what it felt like to be left behind, with no one bothering to look back one last time. So tonight, when he found Ghost curled up in front of his gate, a misshapen figure like a shadow of his own from 10 years ago, Walter didn't need to think. No logic, no paperwork, just action. The truck growled as he steered onto the main road, crossed a narrow wooden bridge, and sped down the slope toward Langford. The lights of the first veterinary clinic glowed faintly through the snow like dying candles. Walter braked hard, jumped out, still holding the blanket-wrapped Ghost. He pushed through the door, boots soaked, coat dripping, eyes full of urgency. The receptionist looked up. Young, cold, voice flat. "Do you have an appointment?" Walter shook his head, voice hoarse from the cold. "No, but this dog's dying." She glanced at the limp form in his arms, then back to her computer screen as if weighing an emergency against her next coffee break. "Emergency treatment fee is $250, she said without looking up. "I don't have it now," Walter said, "but No payment, no treatment," she cut him off, then turned away as if he had vanished. Walter stood there a few seconds longer, hand gripping the blanket now shaking, not from cold, but from rising rage and helplessness. He looked down at Ghost, saw his chest still rise and fall, each breath dragging some part of his soul with it. Then he turned and walked out, without another word. The second clinic wasn't much different. An older man with glasses turned him away more politely, but the result was the same. No money, no room. When Walter stepped outside, snow was falling so heavily that he had to use his elbow to wipe the windshield every few swipes. The night had grown heavier, like the sky was about to collapse. He didn't know where to go next. No names left to call, no clinics left to try. But Ghost was still breathing. Faint, fierce. And it was in that moment, as Walter was about to turn back toward home, where at least Ghost could die in a quiet room, instead of beneath mute snow, that he saw her. Becca, a young woman with hastily tied brown hair, holding a flyer with pictures of dogs and cats, pinned it to a bulletin board beside an abandoned gas station. Her coat was dusted with snow, hands red from the cold, but her eyes still held a strange kind of gentleness. When his truck pulled up to the curb, she looked over, and in that instant, No words, no questions. She stepped toward him. He rolled down the window. Becca tilted her head, saw the dog lying motionless on the seat. Her eyes sank. "Greenwood," she said. 15 minutes west of here. They're not kind, but sometimes they save if someone vouches." Walter nodded. Asked nothing. Didn't ask who she was or why she helped. He just listened as she added, "Tell them I sent you. Becca, from the rescue center. Maybe they'll listen." Then she turned away, and Walter drove into the snow once more. But this time, he wasn't carrying just a dying creature. He was carrying a fragile chance, but a real one. Greenwood Animal Hospital emerged through the snowfall like a frozen block of concrete suspended in the night. Outside, fluorescent light from a white sign bathed the salt and sand-covered pavement below in a pale reflection, like the skin of someone just pulled from the morgue. Walter pulled up to the curb, engine running, heater blowing steadily, and Ghost still lay there, a silent shape bundled in the faded wool blanket, head resting lightly against the seat, breath like a thread about to snap. Walter stepped out, opened the passenger door, and bent down to lift the dog once more. Under the blanket, Ghost's body felt shockingly light, as if he were nothing but bone and a thread of hope that hadn't quite died. Walter wrapped his arms around him carefully, supporting the left hip that was already showing signs of dislocation, then pushed through the door. Inside, the air was cold in a different way. Not the invasive cold of nature, but a controlled chill, from air conditioning, from clean tile floors, from a waiting room so meticulously scrubbed it felt sterile. Overhead lights cast down a harsh white glare, catching dust particles mid-air, freezing everything in a moment suspended out of time. The woman behind the front desk looked up. Middle-aged, pale blonde hair tied back neatly, eyes the color of snow-washed stone, unreadable. "Emergency?" she asked, voice flat and dry as printer paper. Walter nodded, voice rough. "Puppy. Poisoned. Barely breathing. Do you have a method of payment?" she cut in, fingers still resting on the keyboard. Not rudeness, habit turned reflex. "I don't have cash," Walter said, gently placing Ghost onto the stainless steel counter. "I lost my job. No credit card? No pet insurance? No rescue shelter sponsorship?" "Becca, the girl from Rescue Hearts. She told me to come here. She said, maybe someone could help." "Becca is a volunteer. She doesn't have the authority to approve financial waivers," the woman replied, without checking. "We require financial confirmation before treating any case, especially emergencies." Walter looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to understand how a life clinging to breath could still be subject to bank codes before being saved. In front of him, Ghost didn't move. The fur on his chest was soaked in cold sweat, front legs curled inward as if bracing himself. His eyes were half open, half closed, reflecting nothing but the pale neon light above. "You don't understand," Walter said, his voice lowering. "He doesn't have time. 1 shot, 1/4. A warm place. I'm begging." "You're asking me to break protocol," she said, eyes still on the screen. "I'm not authorized." A part of Walter wanted to scream, slam his fists down, shout at a world that had learned to value currency more than compassion. But then he looked down at Ghost and saw. The dog wasn't whining, wasn't fighting, wasn't accusing. He was just breathing, weakly, patiently, as if, in his short life, he'd grown used to being turned away. And this time was no exception. Walter pulled the blanket tighter, lifted Ghost again. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the slow burn of anger and helplessness, from the feeling of walking out of a place called a hospital, with not a single shred of hope. The glass door closed behind him with a quiet hiss, like someone sighing into snow. The wind rose again from the valley, lashing his face with needle-like flakes. Walter returned to the truck, laid Ghost down gently, adjusted the blanket, then sat motionless behind the wheel, not starting the engine, He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this powerless. But tonight, something inside him felt severed. Not his faith in the world, that had vanished long ago, but the belief that right could still triumph over wrong if only you held on tightly enough. Ghost still breathed, just barely. Every inhale felt like he was pulling air from both sides of death. A tear ran down Walter's cheek, not for himself, but for the animal dying in the arms of a world too mechanized to feel. And right then, he made a decision. If no one else would save this dog, he'd keep him alive as long as he could. Not out of duty, not out of guilt, but because he knew death too well. And this time, he chose to stand with life. Walter sat there still, hands resting on the icy steering wheel, eyes fixed on the blank whiteness ahead of the truck, where snow poured down like the sky was trying to bury everything still clinging to life. Beside him, Ghost lay curled in the old blanket, his breathing as thin as paper, his hip twitching now and then with uneven spasms. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the doors, like a voice calling out to no one. It was a moment without hope, only silence. And then, like a single drop of ink on white paper, something moved at the edge of the windshield, faintly, slowly, but enough to make Walter turn his head. Just a few dozen steps away, on the snowy roadside, a young woman stood under a tattered umbrella, pinning a flyer to a rusted notice board beside an abandoned gas station. She wore a knee-length olive coat, dark old rubber boots, one hand gripping a roll of tape, the other holding a flurry of wind-whipped papers. On the flyers were pictures of dogs and cats, some emaciated, others wounded, all with wide, pleading eyes. Beneath each was a bold caption, "Rescue hearts, we never give up." Walter didn't know why he opened the door. Maybe instinct. Maybe he was just so tired of closed doors that he was willing to reach for any handle still ajar. Maybe it was the woman's eyes when she looked at him. Not urgent, not pitying, just quietly recognizing a man who needed a reason not to give up. He stepped forward, Ghost bundled carefully in his arms. The wind tore through his coat, slipped down his collar like it was trying to snatch the last warmth from his chest. The woman looked up, startled to see an old man with a gray, weather-beaten face holding a shivering bundle close. "What happened to him?" she asked, not loudly, but enough to cut through the wind. "Poisoned," Walter said, the word falling like rocks from his throat. "2 vet clinics turned us away. I don't have money." She stepped closer without hesitation, leaned down to look at Ghost. Her expression shifted from surprise to shock in a single breath. Ghost didn't open his eyes, but his body twitched slightly with every gust of freezing wind. His nose had turned dark, lips foamed with dry spittle. "What the hell is wrong with people?" she whispered, then shook her head, as if to drive away the unanswerable question. "I'm Becca," she said quickly. "Volunteer with Rescue Hearts." She looked up, straight into Walter's eyes, and in her gaze he saw something that had long vanished from strangers' faces. A willingness to trust without requiring proof. "Can you still drive?" Walter nodded. "Just tell me where." "Stone Creek Clinic," Becca said, pulling a small scrap of paper from her coat and scribbling quickly. 12 miles west. Road's rough, but there's a doctor there. David Ashford. He's not like the others." "He'll help?" Becca pressed her lips together, then nodded. "If you say I sent you." "No guarantees, but he's the last person I know who still values life more than money." Walter took the paper, his rough fingers brushing hers. Cold but steady. She bent down once more, adjusted the blanket around Ghost, then spoke softly, as if addressing someone who'd just returned from the edge. "Hang in there, little guy." Ghost didn't respond, but one ear twitched faintly. Becca smiled, placed a gentle hand on his head, then stepped back. Walter said nothing more. He turned, his legs heavy, not just with the weight of the dog, but of a life that had seen too many moments where the world looked away. But this time, he walked with a slip of paper in hand, and in his chest, a direction, a person who had left one final door open. As the truck pulled away, Walter checked the rearview mirror. Becca was still there, holding her flyers, watching him go. She didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood still like a marker. A small light in the middle of a white storm. And for the first time all night, Walter didn't feel lost anymore. The road to Stone Creek twisted and iced over, each curve slippery as if testing the patience and steadiness of anyone brave or desperate enough to drive into the night. But Walter didn't stop. Through the fogged headlights and snow-caked windshield, trees flanking the road appeared like silent ghosts standing guard over a forgotten world, one where time had likely stopped long ago. Beside him, Ghost still lay there, a weightless silence. No whimper, no flinch, only the faint, steady rhythm of breath, a fragile miracle. Walter glanced over, and in the moment when the light from the Stone Creek sign cut through the windshield, he saw Ghost's face clearly, ears drooping, eyelashes frozen, but his cheek twitched slightly, the only sign that life still clung to him. Walter pulled up beside the clinic's sliding glass door and honked once, then stepped out quickly. The wind slashed across his face like a blade, but he didn't flinch. He bundled the blanket tighter and lifted Ghost again, like carrying a decaying memory that refused to let go. The automatic door opened with a sound so soft he nearly missed it, an unfamiliar gentleness in a night full of rejection and shut doors. Inside was a soft yellow glow, not the sterile chill of other clinics, no heavy scent of disinfectant, no machine whirring, just pine wood, old paper, and the stale comfort of cold coffee. A man stood behind the counter in a wrinkled white coat, wire-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose, hands flipping through records. "Help me," Walter said. Just 2 words. No more needed. The man, Dr. David Ashford, looked up. He didn't ask about money, didn't check the time. He simply nodded, stepped around the counter, opened the door behind him, and gestured. "Bring him in." Walter followed, legs unsteady. The treatment room was small but tidy. A polished steel exam table, stacks of clean towels on a shelf. David picked up a stethoscope and gently touched Ghost. "How long?" he asked, eyes never leaving the dog. "I'm not sure. Maybe a few hours. Poisoned. Industrial stuff, I think." David paused, glanced at Walter for the first time. "Is he yours?" Walter shook his head. "Found him in the snow. He looked almost gone." David nodded once, didn't ask more. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, fast but not frantic. 4th line, antitoxin injection, temperature check. Ghost flinched once at the needle, but then went still again, as if even pain had become too familiar to react to. "We've got a narrow window," David said, threading the IV into the drip bag. "If it's reached the liver or kidneys, I can't guarantee anything. But if he's still responding, there's hope." Walter stood awkwardly, not knowing what to do with his empty hands. He felt useless. No money, no insurance, not even a name for the dog. Yet here he was, a stranger placing faith in another stranger, all for a creature who couldn't speak, couldn't beg, and who'd never had anyone choose to stand with him. "Have you given him a name?" David asked, checking Ghost's pulse. Walter hesitated. Then, as if pulled from some deep part of his mind, he said instinctively, "Ghost." David raised an eyebrow. "Because he's white?" Walter looked at the dog. Ghost's eyes were barely open, his throat twitching softly as fluid seeped into his small body. "No," Walter said slowly, "because it's like he already died, but didn't leave." The room fell quiet. Only the soft tick of the wall clock and the low hiss of the IV filled the space. David didn't ask anything else. He continued his work, as if that name had just given him a glimpse into a story that needed no telling. Ghost didn't open his eyes, but his chest rose more clearly now. Not much, but enough that Walter, for the first time in years, felt like his hands were holding something still worth saving. Walter never left the waiting room that night. He sat motionless on the stiff plastic chair, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the treatment room door left slightly ajar. Above him, the fluorescent light buzzed with a dull yellow fatigue, like the slow, heavy beat of his own heart. Sluggish, unsure if it still had a reason to keep going. Inside, Dr. David Ashford worked in silence, as if repaying some unspoken debt to Ghost. The IV dripped non-stop. Antitoxins were administered with care. The monitor began to register signals. Walter heard the beeping, the soft click of metal as tubing was replaced, and even faint words of encouragement, unsure if they meant for the dog or the doctor himself. By dawn, David stepped out. His face showed exhaustion, but in his eyes there was something Walter hadn't seen in anyone else all night. A small, real, fragile hope. "He's stable for now," David said, pulling off his gloves and tossing them into a medical bin. "Heart's still weak, liver's showing damage, but neurological response is intact. He didn't give up." Walter rose, his voice rough. "He's endured too much." David nodded, then opened the medical file in his hand. The printed blood work was a mess of abnormal numbers, wildly off-mark, chaotic. "The toxin in his blood," David said, eyes on the page, "isn't something common like rat poison or pesticides. This is more advanced, designed not to kill immediately, but to prolong pain, cause skin irritation, cramping, and nervous system failure. Only a few places could get access to this stuff." "You mean?" Walter began, already sensing the answer was going to be bad. David looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "I suspect this is the kind of toxin used in underground dogfighting circuits. Some of them use it to test pain tolerance, to sort the worthy from the weak. Survivors get trained. The rest are dumped, or used again." The air in the room sank like a cold draft through cracks in stone. Walter felt his body tense, chest tightening, not from the cold, but from the quiet rage welling up deep in his gut. An old fury, long familiar. The kind that used to rise on battlefields when he saw things no morality could name. "That dog," he said, voice flat, "survived all of that. He didn't deserve to die in the snow. He didn't deserve to be left like garbage." David nodded. "He fought. Under that poison, most don't make it past hour 3. He's got willpower. Maybe more than most people." He moved toward the treatment room, waving Walter along. The door opened to a wash of antiseptic and gentle warmth from a space heater. Ghost lay on a padded mat, wrapped in thick blankets, leg stretched out but no longer twitching. One leg was bandaged with a thin IV line. His side had been shaved to examine swelling. His body was so thin his bones poked through patchy fur, but his chest rose with a steady rhythm. Eyes shut, lips parted slightly, as if whispering in a dream only he could understand. Walter stepped closer, knelt beside him, and gently placed a hand on Ghost's head. His fur was soft at the crown, though behind his ears were patches of hardened scarring, reminders of a muzzle tied too tight, too long. Walter traced down his spine, feeling every rib, every scar like a map etched in silence and pain. "He still hasn't disappeared," Walter murmured, eyes fixed on the dog. "A ghost, but one that wants to stay." David stood beside him, silent. Then he said quietly, "There's a reason dogs like him get picked. It's not just strength, it's loyalty, the kind that doesn't fight back, even through agony, the kind that endures, just to be accepted. That's what haunts me the most." Walter didn't speak right away. Then he nodded and said softly, as if speaking to no one but himself, "No one should ever be treated that way, man or dog." In the small room tucked within the snow-covered mountains, Ghost lay at the edge of life and death. But he wasn't alone anymore. Hands had touched him, not for profit, not for purpose, but for one reason alone: to choose life in a world that had turned its back. After 3 days of treatment at Stone Creek, Ghost had survived the worst, though his strength remained low and his body still fragile from the poisoning. The most noticeable and strangest thing was this: he didn't give up. Ghost began keeping his eyes open longer, lifting his head when he heard Walter's footsteps. Once, after David finished an IV drip, Ghost gently licked his wrist, a clumsy, feeble lick, like he wasn't used to touching anyone without being struck in return. Walter, not a man known for showing emotion, couldn't hide the softening in his gaze each time Ghost breathed calmly beside the fireplace. That fragile life was also a tangible reminder. Some things in this world hadn't vanished yet. On the fourth morning, Walter and Ghost left the clinic, returning to the small wooden house clinging to the Colorado mountainside, where snow still fell as if time had never moved. Before they left, David warned, "He'll have panic episodes, not from the body, from memory. Sounds, smells, light, anything can trigger the instincts built through trauma. Don't shout, don't call too sharply, don't let him wake up alone." Walter simply nodded. He didn't need the reminder. He knew too well what it meant to sleep with blades behind your eyelids. The house was the same, quiet, cold, buried in white. Walter had prepared a thick bed, a bowl of warm water, and some thin porridge. Ghost curled up next to the fireplace, eyes half closed, as if just now beginning to grasp the idea. This place held no whips, no chains. That evening, Walter read a book, an old memoir by a soldier he once served with in 1987. The words moved slowly across his eyes, but his mind was elsewhere. A few steps away, Ghost slept. No gasping, no twitching, just sleep. Something so simple, yet for Ghost, a revolution. And then, as night sank deeper, everything changed. Outside, a sudden crack, a hammer blow from the neighbor's cabin, still under roof repairs, echoed across the snowy dark. Then came the engine of a truck starting up, followed by a distant siren. None of the sounds were loud, but they cut through the cold air like thin knives. Ghost bolted upright. First, a twitch in his back. Then his hind legs kicked wildly, mouth open, emitting a strangled rasp like he was being choked. His eyes flew open, but he didn't see Walter. He didn't see the house, didn't see the fire. He saw the camp, the iron cage. The blinding training lights flashed across his face. The collar tightened like a noose. And in the next breath, Ghost launched from his bed like a terrified gust, darting under the dining table into the darkest corner he could find, a place of shadow and pounding heartbeats. Walter dropped the book and stood so fast that the chair fell over. He ran, then stopped. One more step and he'd breached the distance Ghost had just sealed off with fear. He understood. He couldn't approach him like this. Under the table, Ghost let out silent screams. His eyes were glazed, his body flattened to the floor, his chest heaving like he was drowning. His paws clawed at the wooden wall, head banging against a table leg hard enough to bleed. Walter watched, afraid to touch. Because to touch now would be to pour gasoline on a fire. Instead, he sat down, back to the table leg. Close, so Ghost could hear his breathing, but not close enough to touch. He didn't speak, just stayed. Let his presence be the quiet signal words couldn't carry. For reasons he couldn't explain, Walter's mind drifted back to the mortar shelling in Mosul. He hid beneath a dead comrade for 3 hours to avoid being found. He remembered how his body shook, from fear but also cold, from the engine noise, the screams, the sound of metal tearing bone. Every sound from that memory, when it came back, hit like a slap. Ghost was doing the same. He wasn't running from this house. He was running from echoes. Walter sat for almost half an hour, until Ghost's breathing slowed, and the scratching stopped. Eventually, from the darkness under the table, Ghost crawled out. His body soaked in sweat, legs buckling beneath him, he lowered his head into Walter's lap. No bark, no whine, just a gentle lean, shaking as if to say sorry, or to ask for help. Walter didn't speak. He ran his hand gently along Ghost's neck, voice low, like talking to an old comrade still caught in an old dream. "You're safe now. This is home." Ghost shivered. His eyes remained open, but heavy. Walter stayed beside him, back against the wall, hand resting on the dog's warming coat. No words needed, no promises, just presence, when nightmares returned. After the night's panic, Ghost finally fell asleep beside Walter, beneath the firelight fading from the hearth. The room fell so quiet, the creak of wood in the walls sounded like thunder. Walter didn't dare move. He still sat leaning against the table where Ghost had hidden in terror, like a shadow trying to disappear from a world he didn't understand. Ghost was now outside the table's cover, resting his head on Walter's thigh, breath slow and steady, though still tinged with unrest. Every time the fire cracked, his legs twitched slightly. Walter kept his hand on Ghost's back, not pressing, just there. A silent reminder. You're not alone anymore. Not every wound is made of blood, and not every healing needs medicine. Some breaks can't be seen, in trust, in memory, in the way a small creature looks out at a world it never learned to believe in. The next morning, as the first light of a new week glowed through the frosted window pane, Ghost still slept. But this time it was real sleep. No flinching, no waking, no sound. Walter woke up first. He didn't rise, just sat at the edge of the bed, eyes on the rug beside the fire, where Ghost lay curled, one leg trembling slightly, mouth parted in some deep dream. He got up, poured a cup of coffee, and sat by the window. Outside, the snow had stopped falling overnight. The sky was softly gray, no wind, strangely still. Walter liked mornings like this, when movement slowed, when no one demanded anything from him. No orders, no alarms, just himself, and the fragile presence of a life that had brushed death's edge. A few minutes later, Ghost stirred. Not in fear, not panicked, just shifted like any dog would after a long rest. He lifted his head. His light brown eyes met Walter's, and held. That gaze wasn't like anything Walter had ever seen in an animal. It wasn't just recognition, not hungry, not pleading, and not fear. Ghost looked at him like he'd waited a long time to truly see someone, not through a cage, not through a raised hand, not through a leash. Walter forgot to breathe. Ghost looked at him the way someone looks into an old mirror, not just seeing the present, but also all the scratches left behind. No one teaches a dog empathy, but some eyes go beyond instinct. This was the gaze of a being who had endured, been discarded, stood on the edge of survival, and now saw in Walter someone who had walked that same line. No sound, no words, but Walter felt it as clearly as if it were etched in the air. I know you understand. He leaned forward, knelt in front of Ghost, and placed his hand on the dog's chest. Felt a heartbeat, faint heartbeat, but steady. Ghost didn't pull away, didn't flinch, just kept looking. Walter didn't know what exactly made his heart tighten in that moment. Empathy, gratitude, or the ache of seeing his past reflected. But he knew one thing. In Ghost's eyes was a spirit that hadn't surrendered, even when the world tried to break him piece by piece. That afternoon, Walter opened the drawer and took out the notebook Becca had given him when they said goodbye. Brown leather, slightly scuffed. On the first page, in neat blue ink, was a line. Write it down, so what no one hears will still be remembered. He turned to a blank page, placed his pen down, and wrote, Day 2. Ghost slept peacefully. No dreams, no flinching. But this morning, he looked at me like someone who's been lost. No asking, no accusing, just presence. That look felt like a bridge between two long, lonely silences. A homeless dog. A man who forgot how far he'd drifted from himself. Maybe he knows I've been lost too. And maybe what he needs isn't safety. Just someone who knows what it's like when the world goes silent and nobody calls your name anymore. Walter sat quietly after he finished, hand resting on the page. He wasn't one for journaling. In his military years, he wrote reports, signed forms, but never wrote for himself. Not until a dog's eyes awakened something he thought had long died. Evening fell slowly. The snow hadn't melted, but the frost had thinned. Walter called Ghost out to the porch. The dog stepped out carefully, each paw testing the wooden planks, nose twitching at the cold air. Walter stood at the railing, coffee cup in hand. Ghost joined him, standing, not leaning, not leaping, just beside him, like a friend. The two of them stared into the distance, where the pine trees faded into mist and the setting sun cast a soft orange glow. In that moment, neither of them needed to say anything. Walter felt it deeply. He wasn't alone anymore. And when Ghost turned his head and looked at him once more, the same look was still there, a look that didn't need words, yet was strong enough to pull a soul out of the dark. A gaze that pulled you closer, not through force, not through duty, but through something else entirely. The honest presence of two forgotten lives finally found. That night, just as Walter put down his pen after writing a short journal entry, Ghost began to growl. Not a soft whimper or a raspy breath caught between dream and waking, but a real growl. Low, even, from deep within his chest, carrying the primal alertness of a creature that once survived purely by instinct. Ghost didn't move, but his eyes were wide open, his body taut, ears raised like antennas catching an invisible signal. Walter looked up immediately. He rested a hand on Ghost's shoulder, trying to calm him, but the dog didn't break his gaze from the window behind the fireplace, where a thin frost blurred the glass, and beyond it only a cold, white void. Walter walked slowly to the window and drew the curtain aside. Snow was falling, silently, like any other night. No movement, no lights, nothing out of place. But Ghost kept growling. He rose from his mat, moving toward the door with quiet, careful steps, like a trained wolf. His posture said everything. Focused, hyper-aware, ready. When he reached the door, Ghost sniffed hard, gave a low hiss, and pressed his nose against the crack at the base. Then he tilted his head in one single direction, towards the old kennel out back, the one Walter hadn't touched since last winter. Walter's chest tightened. He had lived alone in this mountain cabin for nearly 10 years. Visitors were rare. No one wandered onto his property without reason. And he knew Ghost wasn't spooked for no reason. He flipped on the porch light, threw on his heavy coat, and reached for the old flashlight mounted by the door. The door swung open, and a gust of icy wind swept in. Ghost followed at his heels. No bark, no whimper, head low, body gliding like a whisper across the steps. The moment they stepped outside, Walter froze. In the snow, just 4 paces from the wooden steps, were fresh footprints, larger than his, deeper, with the aggressive tread of military boots, the kind only soldiers or mercenaries wore. At least 3 clear prints led straight toward the kennel corner, then disappeared, as if the person had stopped or doubled back to watch. Walter swept the beam of his flashlight across the fence line. Nothing, but a feeling, sharp, steel-cold, crept down his spine, the unmistakable sense of being watched. Ghost crept forward toward the footprints. He sniffed the boot print once, then froze. No growl. No bark. He backed up 2 steps, hackles raised, and his eyes took on a wild, feral edge, as if he recognized the scent. Not in a good way. Walter moved closer, inspecting the disturbed snow. Then he saw it. By the edge of the fence, where the snow was more deeply compressed, lay a burnt piece of chain, no more than 6 inches long. Curved, snapped at one end, scorched black like it had been cut by intense heat. He bent down and picked it up. Cold. Rusted. But the smell still clung. Scorched leather, antiseptic, and something slick and synthetic, like melted rubber. Walter narrowed his eyes. His mind flashed back to a different night. Not here, but in the old base at Fallujah, where he had once seen a similar chain. The kind used to bind fighting dogs in illegal training camps. A familiar, buried feeling surged back, one he thought he'd left behind in the desert. The feeling of stepping back into a shadow you thought you'd outrun. Ghost barked once, sharp, singular, like a blade slicing through silence. Walter clenched his fist around the chain. His eyes scanned the fence line, waiting for something, anything, to leap from the dark. But nothing came. No running footsteps, no shapes behind the trees, just snow, wind, and a choking stillness, like the world had dropped a warning and dared him to believe it. Walter inhaled slowly, turned back, and signaled Ghost toward the house. The dog followed but glanced back toward the kennel one last time, before crossing the threshold. He didn't shake, didn't cower, but in his eyes was something deeper than fear. It was recognition. The door closed. The latch clicked loudly in the silent house. Walter laid the burnt chain on the table and sat down. Ghost curled beside him, resting his head on Walter's boot, eyes never leaving the strange object. A long while passed before Walter opened his notebook again. He added a few lines beneath his morning entry. Night. Ghost warned me. I found footprints outside. Not hikers, not neighbors. Military boots, a burnt piece of chain. The smell's too familiar, like it came from a place no one should ever return to. Ghost didn't bark out of fear. He barked from memory. Maybe he was once bound by that very thing. The question isn't who left it, it's what are they coming back for? Walter closed the book and set it down. He knew now this wasn't a random rescue, not just some stray in the snow. Ghost hadn't merely escaped. He'd broken free. From a system, a purpose, and now that place knew where to look. By the flickering firelight, Ghost lay curled against Walter's feet, eyes open, breath shallow and quiet, not sleeping, not relaxed, just waiting, like a survivor who knows the darkness doesn't knock before it returns. And outside, snow began to fall again, soft as a reminder. Peace is sometimes just the silence between two storms. Since the night of the footprints, Walter hadn't slept through once. Each time wind hissed across the eaves or branches scraped the window, he sprang up, checked the locks, circled out back to the old kennel, hoping, and not hoping, to find something that would explain the unease pressing into his chest. But there was nothing more. The snow had buried all traces. The burnt chain still sat on the table, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture he thought he'd finished. Ghost changed, too. He slept less. Spent long hours by the window, eyes fixed on the yard like a sentry who never left his post. Even during meals, his ears remained pricked, as if one wrong sound would send him sprinting out the door. Walter didn't stop him. He understood the feeling. Once the world has betrayed you, every silence starts to sound like a warning. 3 days later, Walter returned to Stone Creek to pick up more meds and supplies. Becca, the volunteer who had first sent him to the rescue, was clearing snow by the entrance. She recognized the old truck immediately, her face lighting up when she saw him pull into the lot. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted, voice kind, though her eyes were tired. "How's Ghost?" Walter stepped out, hands in his coat pockets, hesitating before answering. "Still on edge, but alive. That's something." Becca nodded. "That's a lot. Most don't make it through that kind of toxin." She paused, then lowered her voice. "We've had over 20 similar cases in the last few months." Walter looked up. "More than 20? "Poisoned dogs," Becca confirmed, "scattered across the region. Some bodies were found. Some never came back. Signs of capture. We don't have a name for the group behind it, but it feels like someone's testing. Selecting." Walter's hands clenched inside his pockets. The wind bit his neck, but it couldn't chill him more than the shape forming quietly in his mind. Becca's voice dropped again. "I had one. A shepherd, too. White, smart as hell, just 8 months old. One day she was playing in the backyard and gone. No blood, no prints, no noise. Cops said she wandered off, but I know she didn't." Walter looked at her, but his thoughts were already drifting back to Ghost by the fire the night before, the way he'd snapped awake at the sound of a hammer and siren, as if those noises weren't just sound, but triggers for a memory buried too deep. "How long ago?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Becca exhaled. 6 months. I still look. Don't expect much. Just want to know if she's alive." Walter hesitated. The question was already on his tongue, but he didn't speak right away. In his mind, he saw the trembling white dog in the snow, the calloused marks behind his ears, the claw scars on his ribs. All of it is starting to fall into place without needing to force the pieces. Then he asked, "Did your dog have any identifying marks?" Becca frowned, thinking. Left ear had a smoky patch, faint, like someone brushed it with ink, and when stressed, her left back leg used to twitch, like it had been hurt once. Walter's heart sank. He didn't need to check. That smoky patch, he saw it each night while petting Ghost to sleep. Barely noticeable unless you were looking. And that back leg, the first time Ghost stepped down from the truck, it had buckled just a little, favoring it like it carried a memory. He said nothing more, just nodded slightly, as if thanking her, then stepped into the clinic to buy his supplies. That evening, Walter sat by the fire, Ghost curled up by his feet. Most of the lights were off, only the soft orange glow flickering against the walls, casting two shadows, man and dog, stretching long up the ceiling, like two ghosts wrestling with the quiet. Ghost looked up as Walter placed a hand on his head. No fear, no growl, just that deep, silent gaze, the same one every night. "Ghost," Walter whispered. "Or maybe that's not even your name." Ghost didn't react, but in his eyes that carried thousands of painful miles, was a question. "What will you do, now that you know where I came from?" Walter opened the notebook Becca had given him, and for the first time, his hand trembled as he wrote, not from cold, but from facing a truth he hadn't expected. Day 5. Turns out Ghost isn't just a stray I saved from the snow. He's a victim of someone specific, a specific disappearance, a specific dog, once loved, once stolen, once turned into something else. And now, he's here, beside me. He doesn't remember the name he used to have, but he still flinches at the same old wounds. Some pasts shouldn't be unearthed, not because they aren't worth it, but because what comes up might be more brutal than we're ready to face. He set the pen down. Ghost was still looking at him, not barking, not flinching, but for the first time in his eyes was something like a request, not for forgiveness, not for pity, but, "If the place I came from was darkness, will you still let me stay?" Walter stroked his neck gently, nodded slowly, firmly. A promise. "We don't get to choose our past, kid," he murmured, "but we sure as hell get to keep our future." And outside, the snow began to melt. The next day, the snow had begun to melt, revealing a layer of damp soil and strange, unfamiliar marks in the backyard. Walter, still keeping his routine morning patrol, pulled on his boots, zipped up his thick coat, and took Ghost along the western fence line, the same place he'd seen footprints in the snow a few days before. Ghost followed closely, no leash needed. He moved slowly, head low, nose lightly sampling the air as if trying to track down an unslept memory. The wind coming from the forest carried a musty scent, and something faintly burnt, like rust or old metal. As they neared the rocky outcrop at the far edge of the property, less than 10 steps from the pine woods, Ghost suddenly stopped. No bark, no howl, just one low growl, deep, soft, and sharp as a blade slicing into Walter's chest. Walter turned. Ghost's eyes had changed, alert, tense, and unmistakably focused on something he recognized. Walter stepped forward, 3 more paces, and then he saw it. Among the dead trees and the damp mat of fallen leaves stood a dark, rusted metal structure covered in moss. An old iron cage, the kind used for large animals. One of the bars was broken, the hinges corroded, but the door was still shut. Inside, no animal, just a void, empty and haunting. Walter approached slowly, flashlight trained on the cage. The smell of rust mixed with something chemical, old disinfectant maybe, and he held his breath. Then he saw it, a small photo, half buried in the dirt at the corner of the cage. A thin paper print, face down. Walter bent down and picked it up. It was Ghost. No mistake. That look. The white fur with a faint mark near the ear. the curled chest hair that only showed in cold weather. But the ghost in the photo didn't look like the dog standing behind him now. The ghost in the picture had his muzzle taped shut with black duct tape, a heavy chain around his neck, eyes wide with terror and hopelessness. Behind him was a dimly lit warehouse, harsh yellow lights and blurry silhouettes of men. Walter's throat tightened. He turned the photo over. Scrawled in faded, smudged black marker was a single line, all in block print. "You took him from us. Keep him close if you want to keep peace." Walter's hands trembled as he gripped the photo. Ghost approached the cage, sniffed. No sound, but his body went rigid, nose twitching, then a step backward. His hind leg bent, claws digging into the earth, a reflex of an animal who'd once been caged in a place so familiar he didn't need to see it to remember. Walter knelt, pressed his palm against Ghost's chest. His heart raced, not out of fear, but because the memories weren't dreams anymore. They had come back in flesh and iron. Someone had been here, not just to scare them, not just to search for Ghost, but to send a message, a reminder that this dog had once belonged to something Walter had no permission to touch. He scanned the tree line. The woods were unnervingly still. No birds, no wind, just the soft sound of rust flaking off metal when Walter brushed the cage. On the way back, Walter carried the photo and its message. He didn't speak. Neither did Ghost. But their shadows, one tall, one low, stretched long over the damp ground, silent like two soldiers who had just confirmed the enemy had fired the first shot. That night, Walter didn't write in his journal. He simply sat by the fire, holding the photo, eyes fixed on the flame licking the dry wood. Ghost lay beside him, not sleeping, not blinking, just watching the photo as if he knew his name had been called again. From the darkness. Walter spoke slowly, unsure if he was talking to Ghost or himself. "They want you back. Not because they loved you, but because you survived." Ghost looked at him, not with the eyes of someone asking permission, not even the eyes of someone who had run. This gaze was different now, firm, mature, as if Ghost understood. This new life wasn't luck. It was a choice, and it had to be defended. Walter stood, slipped the photo into his notebook, walked to the door and locked it, both the bolt and the steel chain. He checked every window corner, turned off all the lights except for the fireplace. The house sank into a silence pulled taut as wire. In the fire's red glow, Ghost lay beside him, unmoving, and outside, the snow had stopped. Only the cold remained, and something was waiting in the trees, like a shadow that knew how to wait. 3 days after discovering the iron cage in the woods, Walter got a call from Becca. Her voice wasn't panicked, but there was something urgent and heavy beneath it. "Mr. Hayes, I think I just found something I wasn't supposed to." Walter listened, hand tightening around the phone, heartbeat stilling. "Surveillance footage," Becca said. "Anonymous tip. It came to the rescue center's email, no message, just a short clip. And I swear the dog in it is Ghost." Walter didn't ask, "Are you sure?" He didn't need to. He'd seen it in Ghost's eyes long ago. He just hadn't had the proof to name it. Until now. He drove to town the next morning. Becca waited in the back office of the shelter, walls covered in photos of missing dogs, regional maps, and sticky notes like a spider web of desperation. She opened a laptop and loaded the clip from an old external drive. The screen flickered on. Grainy, colorless, silent. Infrared camera footage, coarse and static-filled. A low-ceilinged room, harsh green lighting overhead. Each cage contained one dog, all muzzled, chained, their eyes wide and red from the intensity of the light. Ghost was in the third cage from the left. No name on the bars, only a white stenciled label. B-19. Becca froze the frame, zoomed in on the top left corner. A large man standing there, chewing gum, holding a stun baton, scanning the dogs like he was picking out gear. "That's Dean Klasko." Becca whispered before Walter even asked. Former military dog trainer. Dishonorably discharged in 2012 for animal abuse in a classified test program. I read his name in a decommissioned file once. Never thought he'd still be active. In the dark. Walter stared at the screen, a weight settling hard in his chest. In the clip, Dean walked toward cage B19, toward Ghost. He didn't strike, just tapped the bars and smiled. Ghost, or rather B19, recoiled, but didn't bark, didn't cry, didn't growl, just lay still, eyes staring upward, not at the man, not at the exit. Eyes that had given up. Becca was silent. They don't see them as dogs, she said finally. Just test subjects. The name doesn't matter. B19 is a code for survival, for control. Ghost never had a name until you gave him one. Walter didn't speak, but his fists were clenched, forearms taut beneath his sleeves. A retired soldier can tolerate a lot, but the sight of a living being reduced to a number is something he'll never accept. Becca opened a still image from an attached document, a list of disqualified specimens. Under B19, the handwritten note read, "Does not resist under torture. Too passive. Useless. Discard." Walter stood so fast his chair screeched across the floor. Ghost had once been deemed unusable, thrown away not for weakness, but for lacking the brutality needed for someone's blood game. Now he lived, not to fight, but simply to exist, and maybe to tell the story. Walter sat back down, rubbing a hand over his brow, and murmured, "No one's born to be a number. No dog should live without a name, then die forgotten in a cold cage." Becca nodded. "Ghost was never called anything until you." Walter exhaled, as if the name itself was the last thing left anchoring the soul that hadn't yet been taken from this dog. That night, back at home, Walter opened the notebook and began to write without pause. Day 6. Ghost used to be B19, a code, a specimen, a number marked for disposal. I thought I gave him his name. But no, I was only the first one to hear what he'd been trying to say all along. Ghost isn't Ghost because he's white, not because he escaped death, but because he's the memory of what humanity once threw away, still walking, quietly, to remind us that compassion isn't luxury. It's what remains when everything else falls apart. He closed the journal. Ghost lay beside him, hadn't left his side since the moment they returned. No bark, no whine. But in his eyes, something had changed. No longer lost, no longer hiding. Now, it was the gaze of a being who knew exactly what he'd endured, and knew from this point on that every step forward would be a choice, not one made by a code, but by a name, with a soul. Ever since Walter found out that Ghost was once B19, he no longer looked at the dog as something fragile that needed protecting. He saw him instead as a creature that had fought, silently, for months, to hold on to the last piece of its soul in a place designed to turn it into a monster. The name Ghost was no longer a casual nickname he had given. It became part of a story, a leftover spirit, one that had survived and refused to play the role it had been assigned. Ghost changed quietly. He moved with less sound, watched more carefully, and every night slept near the front door, as if he knew his existence itself was an open invitation for darkness to return. That night, the air turned cold suddenly. Snow fell thin but relentlessly, and the wind tore through the pines behind the house like a whisper in a language no one understood. Walter was reading an old journal entry from a fellow soldier when Ghost, who had been lying still at his feet all evening, suddenly sprang up. No growling, no howling. He simply rose, slowly, like a white shadow slipping out of the fireplace glow, and charged toward the front door, fur bristling. Walter jumped to his feet, instincts honed in, war kicking in. His hand went to the drawer for the pistol he hadn't touched since leaving the army. He stepped quickly onto the porch. Ghost was already at the door. His ear pressed to the wood. He inhaled deeply, then let out a low hiss. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. That scent again. The one still lingering on the scorched chain leash Walter had found days earlier. He cracked the door open. Cold air slapped him across the face. Outside, the motion sensor light cast its glow over a thin layer of snow, and for a split second, he saw it. A low figure slipping past the fence line, running close along the dense trees on the western edge. Ghost let out a roar and launched through the door like an arrow. Walter didn't have time to call him back. He fired one shot into the sky, a sharp warning tearing through the frozen night, echoing into the forest like a declaration. This place is not easily touched. The sound of footsteps in the snow scattered and then vanished. Ghost returned less than a minute later. He hadn't chased far, just enough to drive the stranger off. But when he reached the porch, his eyes still glowed with the fire of something that had once been taught to hunt, and now turned that instinct toward protection. Walter called the police that same night. A patrol arrived over 30 minutes later with spotlights and forensic gear. No one found the intruder, but boot prints, military grade, were clear in the damp snow. Nearby was a long drag mark, like someone had fallen and gotten back up. On a stone close by, a fresh streak of blood. The police took samples, said nothing meaningful beyond the usual reassurance. Probably just a petty thief. Walter didn't argue, but he knew. Ghost knew. This wasn't a theft. This was a check, a test, to see how much the asset had truly turned, to see who was sheltering him, and maybe to see if he remembered. That night, after the police left, Walter sat on the porch again, eyes on the frozen woods. Ghost lay by his feet, head resting on his boot, eyes wide open. Walter wrote, Day 7. Someone came back. Not for Ghost, but for what he represents. A broken link in a chain they don't want anyone alive to talk about. I didn't ask Ghost if he recognized the scent tonight, but his eyes said enough. This wasn't the first time, and it sure as hell won't be the last. Before going to bed, Walter locked the front door with both the wooden bar and a thick rope tied to the handle. An old habit from combat camps in war zones. Ghost didn't flinch. He stood there, part of the shadow guarding the door. Outside, the snow began to fall again. But this time it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a cover over a reopened scar. After the night, Ghost intercepted the stranger, and Walter's gunshot tore the silence. The quiet cabin on the mountainside never quite felt the same. Everything stayed where it was. The coffee mug, the notebook, the old chair by the fire. But the air had thickened. Every gust of wind against the window now carried an unspoken warning. Ghost slept less. Each night, he shifted spots 2, 3 times, ears up, eyes fixed toward the forest, the place that had once swallowed him whole in his early years. Walter knew he wasn't just on guard. He was waiting. And then, one morning no one expected, before the sun had even pierced the thick snow clouds, came a knock at the door. Not rushed, not loud. 3 steady, deliberate knocks. Ghost jumped up. No bark. But instead of rushing forward, he stopped at the door and turned to Walter, waiting for a nod, as if to say, "This one isn't a stranger." Walter stepped forward, fingers brushing the pistol by the desk. But he didn't draw. Something in Ghost's eyes made him pause. He opened the door, and the man standing there needed no name, no memory to surface. Frank. His younger brother, a former firefighter, a man who had almost died in a warehouse collapse in Montana. The same man Walter hadn't heard from in 5 years, not since a fight they never resolved, over a person they had both failed to save. Frank stood tall, in a faded, thick coat, with a soldier's rucksack slung over one shoulder. His beard was rough, like he hadn't bothered with mirrors. But his eyes were sharp, fire still in them. The kind of look from someone who didn't talk much, but always knew where he'd been. No greetings, no hugs, no sighs, just a slight nod between 2 men who shared blood, fought side by side, and lost each other to years of silence. Frank stepped in without asking. as if he'd never left. He dropped his bag on the floor and, naturally, like he'd done it 100 times, pulled a gray-white business card from inside his coat and placed it on the table between 2 mugs of coffee. Walter looked down. Jordan Kimball, Special Agent, Organized Crime Division, Department of Justice, clean type, no phone, no address, just the name and title. Enough to know, not someone ordinary, and not here out of curiosity. He contacted me 3 weeks ago, Frank began, his voice steady like reporting a fire scene. Asked about an old training site in Wyoming, off map. I'd been there once during a rescue course. He didn't say much, but I saw it in his eyes. He knows? Walter picked up the card. The paper was special. No fingerprints, not easy to tear. Intentional. Cautious. Frank continued. They know about Ghost. Don't call him that. Call him B-19. They know he's alive. They know he's being hidden. No subpoena, no threats. But you know what silence like that means. Walter clenched the card. Ghost was now back near the fireplace, lying down, but alert. Ears up. Eyes trained on the 2 men, as if he understood that what was being discussed didn't belong to today, but to a past that refused to stay buried. Frank didn't ask why Ghost was here. Didn't ask why Walter took him in. He only said, I didn't come to apologize. I came because if they come, if the ones who caged him are still out there and want to drag him back, there's only one place I trust he'll be safe. Walter didn't answer, but he poured more coffee into Frank's cup. A small, simple act, but to men who've stood in fire and smoke, it means more than a hug they're too old to give. Later, Walter opened his notebook and wrote, Day 8. Frank is back. Didn't mention Mom. Didn't bring up Montana. Didn't ask how I've been. He just put a name on the table, a threat and a past. We're not friends, but we're blood. And Ghost, somehow, is the only thing still keeping us in the same room without a coffin between us. Ghost stood up, walked to Frank, eyes unblinking. Frank knelt, held out a hand. No coaxing, no petting, just letting Ghost decide. Ghost sniffed, then gently rested his head in Frank's palm. Not to seek comfort, but as a silent acknowledgement that the man before him did not belong to the dark, even if he had once walked close to it. Frank looked up at Walter, and for the first time in years, Walter saw something in his brother's eyes that wasn't flat. We already lost someone once, Frank said. Let's not lose one more. And for the first time, Walter nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. After meeting with Frank, Walter barely slept that night. In the small house, bathed in the quiet glow of firelight, he sat alone at the kitchen table, holding Agent Jordan Kimball's business card, eyes fixed on the window where Ghost still lay, watching. The cold, printed lines on the card didn't just represent a name. They signaled a silent, organized force, ready to reclaim whatever it deemed rightfully its. Ghost didn't sleep deeply either. He kept shifting, as if sensing the shift in the air, that unspoken feeling animals once hunted as pups never forget. Danger is closing in. The next morning, before sunlight could stretch over the pines, Walter put on his coat, slipped a small notebook, a pistol, and a dark old Zippo lighter, a gift from a friend long gone, into his pocket. When Frank asked where he was going, Walter answered simply, "To see Jed. I need to confirm something." Frank asked no more. He knew that name. Jed Harmon. Once a special liaison soldier in the war. Later, a shady middleman linked to illegal dogfighting trades, underground training, and worst of all, rumored to have smuggled Ghost out of Camp B-19 during a purge. Walter drove alone, cutting through snowy roads toward a log cabin buried in a ravine, long abandoned since the coal mines shut down. Jed's old house was still there, worn, dark, desolate, as if time itself had stopped there many winters ago. He knocked, but no one answered. Walter pushed the door open. It swung too easily, no lock, no chain, as if the owner had stopped caring about keeping anything inside. The house was empty, no furniture, no radio static, no sign of life. Everything was too neatly arranged, eerily so, like someone had deliberately erased their presence. Walter passed the kitchen, descended the wooden stairs into the basement that used to be Jed's wine cellar. The lights didn't work. He followed the beam of a small flashlight, scanning every cold cement step. At the far end of the cellar, behind a crooked bookshelf, he found a thick wooden box, sealed with a rusted iron latch, but unlocked. On top, in smeared black marker, were the words, "Not for the hasty. If you found this, you already know what to do." Walter opened the box. Inside, a thick file bundle tied with rope, a cloth-wrapped external hard drive, and a row of worn plastic cards, each labeled with a code and an attached photo. He pulled the first one. B01 Malinois, transferred to Alpha Facility. Status: Aggression Standard met, retained. The second, B06 Doberman. No resistance. Disposed. Then the 31st, B19 White Shepherd. The photo was grainy, but unmistakably Ghost, or a younger, scrawnier version of him, eyes already carrying a sorrow too deep for any animal. Notes beneath. Weak response to electric whip. Did not bite when provoked. No resistance under isolation conditions. Status: Disposal. Assigned to Harmon for handling. Walter froze. He didn't need more confirmation. Jed had, somehow, saved Ghost, or at least gotten him out of that system before they could process him like defective stock. He opened the file bundle. Inside was a coded registry. Project name: Crimson Collar. Bolded below: Conditional reflex cloning for strategic animals, sorted by absolute obedience capacity. Objective: build a canine unit with no emotion, no resistance, no attachment, only command compliance. Ghost had been part of that. A number in a cold classification table. A living creature forced into becoming a tool. But he hadn't complied. He didn't bite when beaten. Didn't snarl when threatened. And that defect had saved him. Walter exhaled. The cellar was cold and dark, but his blood surged hot, as if he had stepped back into a trench where truth didn't fire bullets. It fired straight at belief. He took the hard drive, the file, stuffed them in his pack, then turned and left without closing the door behind. A silent farewell to Jed, a man who had strayed from the light, but may have chosen the quietest redemption. Back home, Ghost ran to greet him, sniffed around the pack, then paused. He looked up at Walter, eyes sparking with something like memory waking from sleep. Walter stroked his head, murmuring, "B19. Maybe they gave you a number, but you chose to keep your heart. And for that, you're not defective. You're the last witness to something they never wanted the world to know, that even in iron cages, compassion can survive." Ghost didn't bark. He simply rested his head on Walter's hand, gently, silently, as if he understood. Walter hadn't even fastened the backpack strap when Ghost froze at Jed's doorstep, body tight as a drawn bow, ears up, a low growl rising from his throat, short, sharp, quiet, but enough for Walter to know. Danger wasn't far. The wind from the ridge carried an unfamiliar scent. Not an animal, not firewood. It was human skin, gun oil, cleaning solvents, a stench only trench-born men could identify from miles away. Walter turned. Across the gray tree line, two figures emerged. No hats, no uniforms, just two men in dark coats, faces unremarkable but eyes razor-sharp, and footsteps light, too light for deep snow. Professional hunters. Not for game, for people. Walter didn't wait for a shout. He crouched, pulled Ghost and the file pack toward a narrow trail west of the cabin, plunging into the snowbound woods. Snow reached his knees, wind slapped his face like stinging needles, but he kept going, left foot forward, right foot crossing, the old march rhythm from his days near the northern border. Ghost ran beside him, never straying, silent, as if he knew this wasn't the time to be a dog, but to be a comrade. Footsteps behind were faster than expected. One bend through the trees, and the gap shrank. A deep voice called, "Stop, old man! What you have doesn't belong to you!" Walter tightened his grip on the backpack, veered left, breaking into a slope trail. But as his foot hit the icy rock, a shot cracked the air. Cold, sharp, accurate. Ghost instantly lunged sideways, using his body to push Walter into the snow. The bullet whizzed past his ear, splintering a tree behind him. Walter rolled, grabbing Ghost tight, heart pounding. Behind him, snow tore. Boots pounded. But Ghost didn't snarl. He looked Walter dead in the eyes. It was clear. Run. Walter gritted his teeth, hauled up the pack, and bolted down the slope toward the frozen stream beneath the cliffs. Wind clawed his cheeks, snow poured into his collar, his legs sank deep. But he didn't stop. As they crossed the stream, he glanced back, and in a flash, he saw one of the men raise a gun, braced, ready to fire again. Ghost didn't wait for orders. He sprang from Walter's side, a white arrow in flight. No bark, no howl, just a streak of instinct long repressed. The man flinched, fired, missed. Wind and Ghost's sudden veer spoiled his aim. Walter wouldn't let Ghost fight alone. He drew his pistol, not to shoot the man, but the snow near the second one's feet. Snow exploded. A startled yell broke the chase rhythm. Ghost used the moment to retreat, racing back to Walter. They didn't stop to check if it worked. They crossed the stream, climbed the slope, slipped into a narrow canyon trail known only to locals, and vanished beyond the trees, leaving behind two breathless, cursing men in the gray snow. When they finally paused to rest, Walter leaned on his knees, chest heaving. Ghost lay beside him, panting hard, but eyes locked on where they had come from. In the snow ahead of them, a small drop of blood. Not Ghost's, not Walter's. A sign the enemy had grown impatient. Walter opened his pack, checked the file box. Still intact. But his eyes now held more than resolve. They held understanding. He was starting to see why Ghost had survived. Not because he was stronger, not because he ran better, because he refused to respond the way they wanted. Ghost didn't fight to win. He fought to live. And now he lives to keep the truth from being buried beneath the cold silence of men in suits, with guns, who think no one remembers a dog once labeled B-19. Walter pulled out his notebook and scribbled. Day 9. They fired live rounds. Ghost shielded me. They hunt us like they fear the voice of a dog. But Ghost is no longer just a dog. He's the last living memory. And I won't let him die again. In the distance, the wind rose again. Cold. But now Walter knew. Cold was nothing compared to silence. Becca's house nestled low on the hillside, hidden behind old pines and a blanket of snow soft as a silver shawl draped over the shoulders of time. Compared to Walter's cabin in the high ridge, this place felt warmer. There were voices, the faint scent of cinnamon from the kitchen, and most of all, old photographs scattered across the walls, as if life once bloomed here before winter froze every tender sound. Becca opened the door without hesitation. She wasn't surprised to see Walter. She was surprised to see Ghost. He stood beside Walter, still, snow clinging lightly to his back, eyes locked on hers, not fearful, not expectant. Just there. The presence of a being who had endured something no words could truly define. Becca froze. She let out a soft breath and reached a hand to the doorframe, steadying herself. Is it you? Ghost didn't bark. He didn't leap like other dogs might when they recognize someone. He simply stepped forward, slowly, head tilted, eyes deep and still, as if confirming his reflection in her gaze. She stepped back slightly, letting them in. Her voice trembled. Come in. It's going to be a cold night. In the small kitchen, golden light glowed above the stove. The kettle hissed quietly. Walter sat on a wooden chair by the fireplace, and Ghost lay with his chin resting on Walter's foot, not leaving his side. Becca placed 2 cups of tea on the table, her hands trembling slightly, then sat down, eyes never leaving Ghost, as if seeing something she had never thought she'd have the chance to see again. Walter spoke. Not everything, but enough. About Ghost being designated B-19, about the Crimson Collar training camp, about the gunshot in the snow, and about the file box he had recovered from Jed's basement. Becca remained silent through it all. She didn't interrupt, didn't nod, just sat there, eyes misting when she heard B-19, her hand tightening around the teacup, as though trying to hold on to a memory slipping away. "For a long time," she said softly, "I didn't know if Ghost was even alive. I wasn't sure if I should keep looking." Walter looked up. Ghost still lay, but his ears twitched. "Her name was Lila," Becca continued. "My sister. She was 12 at the time, bullied at school, isolated, and then she stopped speaking. Not to me, not to our parents, not to any therapist. We tried everything." She let out a dry, brittle laugh. "Medication, therapy, private schools, nothing worked. Until one day I brought home a small white puppy, skinny, abandoned at the shelter. Nobody wanted it. It just lay there like it was trying to disappear." Walter glanced at Ghost. He didn't react, but something shifted in his eyes. He was listening now. "Lila didn't say anything when I brought him home. But the next morning," Becca pressed her lips tight. "She came out of her room, picked him up, and whispered to me. He's sad. He doesn't know why he was left behind. But maybe if we talk to him, he'll be okay." And from then on, she smiled, genuinely this time, she spoke to him every day. Not to me, but to Ghost. She told him stories, lullabies, whispered secrets she never told another soul. Ghost never spoke back. But he listened, and somehow that was enough to pull her back from the edge. Walter's chest tightened. Not with pity, but with recognition. As a man who had survived war, he knew the value of a living creature who simply listened without judgment. Becca looked down, her voice quieter now. Then one morning, Ghost was gone. Back door open. No blood, no broken leash, no footprints. Police said maybe he ran off, but I knew someone had taken him. Ghost gently lifted his head from Walter's foot. He walked to Becca, stopping just within arm's reach, then tilted his head, the same way he had done with Walter that snowy night on the porch. Becca stared at him, eyes blurring with tears. "You're not that same little dog anymore, are you?" Ghost didn't bark, but he stepped forward very slowly and pressed his head to her hand. A light touch, like a quiet answer. "I'm still me, but I've been farther than you ever imagined." The backroom door opened. Lila, now 17, stood silently in the frame, long hair falling over a mint-green sweater. She didn't speak. No one had called her. But when she saw Ghost, her eyes widened, then slowly welled up with tears. Ghost turned to her. No tail wag, no howl of joy. He simply sat down, raised his head, the gaze of a friend who had been lost, now returned not to ask forgiveness, but to say, "I'm still here." Lila stepped forward, knelt, and wrapped her arms around Ghost. No words, no sobs, just a silent embrace, in a winter not yet thawed, but perhaps warm enough to remind a heart how to beat again. Becca looked at Walter, eyes red. "You see, he's not just a dog who survived. He's the last place children in pain can still believe in kindness." Walter nodded gently. Ghost turned to him, as if to confirm once more. "I was B-19, but someone gave me a name, and from that moment I belonged to people who no longer wanted to die." When Lila drifted sleep on the sofa, Ghost lying beside her with his head on her leg, Becca quietly pulled Walter out onto the porch. The night wind slipped through the pine trees, burning cold through memories they had just begun to warm. Neither of them spoke at first, just listened to the wind grazing the roof, the creaking of snow-laden wood, and the faint hum of truths left unspoken. Then Becca said, voice firm and steady, "We can't keep running." Walter wasn't surprised. He had seen it in her eyes when she looked at Ghost, not the eyes of someone who had just found a lost dog, but the eyes of someone who had just chosen their side. "In Jed's files," Becca continued, "there's mention of one final location, where they moved the program after Crimson Collar was exposed 3 years ago. No coordinates, just 3 words, Quill Rock Facility." Walter nodded. He remembered. Among hundreds of pages, that name had been underlined in red, italicized, with a single note. Reserved for Phase 2 candidates. Candidates like Ghost, he said, glancing toward the door still glowing with light from the living room. Becca didn't reply. She opened her phone, pulled out a photo of a paper map from the files, and pointed to an empty zone near the western mountain range, a place omitted from most travel maps due to its treacherous terrain and severe weather. Quill Rock used to be a quarry on the mountainside. There was a wartime training post nearby, later shut down, but recently locals have reported trucks coming and going at night. No plates, no tail lights. Walter gripped his coat strap tightly. That old feeling returned, like the time he and his unit entered an unmarked enemy zone. Not fear, just the instinct of someone who's survived where no one should. "We have to go," he said without pause. "Tonight," Becca replied. They didn't wake Lila. Becca left a note on the table and a photo of Ghost as a puppy. Lila would understand. Those who have brushed with death know some goodbyes don't need promises of return. They only need to know you left for what's right. The old pickup truck pulled away from town just past midnight. Walter drove. Becca sat beside him, eyes locked on the digital map. Ghost lay in the back seat, not asleep, awake the entire drive, head resting against the seat, gaze like a soldier who hasn't let go of his rifle since his first night back from hell. Streetlights fell away like abandoned memories. The road climbed. Pavement turned to broken rock and frozen ground. The wind howled louder, and as they crossed the Shadow Creek Pass, Ghost shifted, sat upright, head high, ears rigid, eyes fixed forward, as if recognizing a scent, a sound, a feeling etched into his very bones. "We're close," Walter said. No one needed to confirm. Becca pointed to a snow-covered turnoff. "There. No signpost, but if we keep going, we'll reach the quarry's edge." Walter turned off the headlights, slowed. The truck crept through the pines, tires crunching on snow. No one spoke, not out of fear, but because silence now felt sacred. Then, in the dim cabin light, it appeared. A structure sunken into the mountainside. Moss-covered concrete walls, rusted iron fencing, and a half-moon entrance descending into the earth like the open mouth of a waiting beast. Ghost whined. Not a bark. A low, fractured sound. The sound of a creature remembering the steel cage, the sting of the whip, the breath of other dogs who never woke up on cold concrete. Walter killed the engine. They sat in darkness. "You're not going back to be taken," he said, turning to Ghost. "You're going back for the ones who never made it out." Ghost looked at him. No doubt. No fatigue. Only acceptance. As if he understood. This is the final door, and behind it, something must end. Becca unzipped her bag, pulled out the hard drive from Jed's files. "If there's anyone alive in there, if this place is still running," she said, "they'll face what they did, and they'll face Ghost." Walter opened his notebook. His hand didn't tremble. He wrote the final line on the page. Day 10. We've reached Quill Rock. The final camp. The final return. Ghost didn't come for vengeance. He came to prove that what they called a failed prototype still knew how to love, and would never back down while the light still needed him to walk forward. Outside, dawn hadn't broken yet, but some sunrises begin in the heart, not in the sky. As Walter, Becca, and Ghost reached the crumbling entrance of the old Quill Rock facility, an unmarked SUV crept in silently from the east. Its headlights were off, and the engine shut down before the vehicle came to a full stop. The door opened, and out stepped Jordan Kimball, the man who had once left only a business card on Walter's kitchen table and never said more than necessary. No introductions, no small talk, just a long look at Ghost, followed by a quiet nod, as if confirming, it's him. Subject B-19. The prototype that refused to comply as designed, yet survived by embodying what humans had forgotten to teach, that loyalty cannot be forced. Behind Jordan came 4 federal agents in charcoal gray thermal suits, blending perfectly into the snowy landscape. Their hands carried weapons, thermal imagers, and infrared cameras. But at the center of their formation, it was Ghost who led the way. Walter approached. "You read Jed's files?" Jordan nodded, and cross-referenced them with 36 missing dogs from northern shelters over the last 3 years. Becca handed him the hard drive. "It contains footage, identification codes, and training logs." Jordan accepted it, his eyes never leaving Ghost. "We couldn't act without a cause. Now we have both a reason and a guide." Snow began falling again as the team followed the sloped path into the mountain. Morning hadn't fully broken, but the eastern sky began to blush softly, its light casting a muted glow over the snow like a promise not yet fulfilled. Ghost took the lead. No leash, no commands. He moved by instinct, sniffing the wind and retracing a map engraved in memory, bleach, metal, antiseptic, and the ghost of fear from those who once shared cages, cried out at night, then fell permanently silent. Becca whispered as if to herself, "He remembers." No one taught him, but he remembers the way back to pain. Ghost stopped at a mossy concrete wall, tapping his paw against a rusted vent. Jordan knelt, scanned the area with an ultrasonic camera, then nodded. "There's a hollow behind this, and a buried tunnel. They didn't just rebuild it, they expanded it." One agent used an electronic lockpick. A seam cracked open in the wall, just wide enough for a person to slip through. It was cold, damp, and smelled like a punch to the face, the stench of confinement, neglect, and sedation. They moved in silently. Their headlamps revealed a steel-floored corridor. On either side were cages with mesh-covered doors. Inside, nearly 20 dogs, pit bulls, Dobermans, Malinois, and even white shepherds like Ghost. Each one was chained, muzzled, and frozen, as if sedated into submission. Becca choked. "They're not moving. They're not responding." Jordan took quick footage. "They're alive, barely breathing but still has a heartbeat." Ghost walked slowly to a cage. Inside, a young Malinois, maybe a year old, whimpered weakly, its eyes cloudy. But when it saw Ghost, it tried to rise. No bark, no growl, just a slight tilt of the head. The same gesture Ghost once gave Walter in the snow. A silent plea. "Are you real?" Ghost pressed his nose against the wire. He didn't growl, didn't pace, just waited. Walter clenched his fists. His throat burned. In the quiet, he realized, these animals weren't afraid of people. They were afraid of being forgotten. Jordan motioned. "Lower level. It could be storage. It could be where the drugs are kept." Becca whispered, "If the experiments are still active, this isn't over." Walter looked at Ghost. He still hadn't moved. His gaze wasn't that of a broken creature. It was the stare of a witness. A survivor surrounded by siblings is still waiting for rescue. Walter scribbled into his notebook, "Day 11. He brought us to hell, not because he remembered, but because he never forgot." And now, standing among those too silenced to cry, Ghost says everything no one ever could. At the end of the corridor, a steel door opened. Footsteps echoed. Jordan signaled the team to crouch, hand on his trigger. Ghost turned his head. His eyes were clear. The final door is about to open, and the truth will no longer be chained. The steel door didn't swing open by accident. It was opened by the same hand that once caged Ghost. Dean Klasko. Still tall, muscled arms inked with faded military markings, a face like carved stone. But nothing marked him more than the look in his eyes. The kind of man who thought training a dog meant stripping it of soul. The kind of man who never regretted ordering pain. He stepped out, gun raised, not at Jordan, but at Becca. "Don't move!" he barked, voice still full of command. "You think it's that easy to tear down Crimson Collar?" Ghost didn't move. No growl, no warning, just tension. His entire body drawn like a bowstring. Dean yanked Becca close, muzzle pressed to her temple. In his other hand, he pulled a small device, the detonator for the base. Take your files. Take your footage. But him, he pointed at Ghost, he dies today. My greatest failure ends here. Walter raised his gun. Not to aim, not to threaten, just to stand ready. He looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at Dean. Not in fear, not in rage, just sorrow. A deep sadness, as if somewhere in him there was a wish this man had changed. Dean sneered. You know why he won't bite? Because I trained him not to. B-19 wouldn't respond. I called him defective. And you want to call him a hero? Becca shut her eyes. Jordan made a signal. Another agent flanked, but Ghost growled. Softly. A warning. Don't. Walter understood. This wasn't a tactical moment. This was Ghost's choice. Dean hissed. Trade your life for his, old man. Or. He didn't finish. Ghost lunged. No order. No hesitation. From a low crouch, he launched like a white missile, slamming into Dean with the full force of a life unlived. Gunfire erupted. Walter shot simultaneously, striking Dean's shoulder. Dean fell backward. His gun dropped. The detonator skidded across the floor. Ghost tumbled, rolled, and rose limping. Becca backed away, gasping but unharmed. Dean lay flat, blood darkening the moss-stained floor. No screams now. Just wide, silent eyes locked on Ghost, the defective one, filled with something Walter couldn't quite name. Hate, or maybe regret. Ghost didn't move closer. He watched, from a distance, as if saying, I'm not like you, and I never will be. Outside, snow continued to fall. When they left Quill Rock, the sun had crested the ridge, casting gold over the pine forest. A world once buried in white pain, now bathed in morning light. The surviving dogs were loaded into rescue trucks. Some were given antidotes. Others would need years to learn how to walk toward sunlight without fear. Becca hugged Ghost, tears falling into the fur on his neck. Jordan shook Walter's hand. I used to believe the system couldn't save a number, he said, looking at Ghost. But maybe what we call evidence, you call family. Walter said nothing. He knelt beside Ghost, not to examine wounds, but to place a hand on his beating heart. They called you broken, he whispered. But to me, you're the one right thing this world forgot to keep. Ghost lowered his head, touching his forehead to Walter's. A gesture, small, but deeper than any thank you a human language could offer. They returned by the same path. No medals, no headlines, only a road of stone, tire tracks in the snow, and paw prints, the quiet legacy of a dog who walked through hell and never lost what made him whole. The ending, as it always should be, wasn't where the story stopped, but where they finally understood why it began. In the snow, where Ghost was once discarded like nothing, and returned as proof that love, survival, and trust still exist. The snow was still falling gently when they returned to the old cabin on the Colorado Ridge, the place where it had all begun, where Walter had once lifted a frail white creature from deep snow, its eyes nearly done searching for life. Now Ghost walked that same path, but differently, no longer trembling, no longer dragging his feet, but walking slowly, steadily, the gait of a survivor who carried with him the souls of those long forgotten. The blizzard had passed. The wind had stilled. And in that silence, Walter realized that silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the only moment when a person could truly hear themselves breathing. Ghost's hind leg was injured, not badly, but enough to give him a limp. A long gash down his thigh, blood-crusted and freshly bandaged by Becca's careful hands. She had used the softest gauze, tending to him like one touches memory. Ghost didn't whimper, didn't flinch. He simply rested his head on Walter's knee, eyes quiet, as if to say, we made it home. Walter gently stroked his neck, now covered in thicker winter fur. His fingers brushed against rough patches, faded scars, some maybe from the final fight, others from older lashes that never healed clean. Wherever they came from, they remained like lines etched into the soul. You survived. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead into Ghost's warm coat. His shoulders trembled, not from cold, but because in Ghost he saw himself, in the way the dog endured in silence, asked for nothing, just like he had, years ago, in a muddy trench, cradling a fallen friend, too numb to cry. "We made it back," Walter murmured, his voice low as wind brushing dried branches. "No one thought you'd live. Just like no one thought I'd ever walk off the battlefield." Becca sat on the porch steps, hands cupped around a mug of hot tea. She looked out towards the forest, still blanketed in white, but no longer threatening. Afternoon sunlight pushed through the thick clouds, casting a soft golden hue across the frozen ground. She said nothing. Perhaps, after all that had happened, everything worth saying had already lived in Ghost's eyes, when he faced Dean Klasko and chose to step forward not out of instinct, but out of love. That night they sat around the fire. No alcohol, no celebration, just 3 humans and a creature once labeled a failed experiment, now sleeping peacefully at Walter's feet, twitching sometimes from nightmares, but always waking when touched. Walter opened his notebook. Only a few lines left. He wrote, "Day 12. Ghost carries scars, both on his body and in his heart. But he still believes, still chooses to save, and still lets others hold him, as if the world hasn't been cruel enough to destroy that trust." He laid the pen down, glancing at Ghost. The firelight danced across his white coat, casting a shadow on the wooden wall, the silhouette of a wolf, perhaps. But not howling, not alone. Ghost had never been alone. Becca whispered like a breath, "I think he sees the sunrise in his dreams now." Walter smiled. He believed it too, because for the first time in many years, in a house once filled with sighs and shadow, sleep had returned, and it came without screaming. The next morning, the snow had stopped. The gray clouds began to thin, revealing a sky of soft, pale blue, like worn silk being pulled through the light. The wind no longer tore through the pine woods. It only brushed the dry branches gently, like a quiet goodbye. Peaceful, silent, and without a promise. Becca stood on the porch, a small backpack slung over one shoulder. Her wool gloves still carried white strands of Ghost's fur. She didn't rush. She simply waited until Walter came out, holding a fresh mug of tea, and gave her a quiet nod in place of farewell. "Lila's doing okay," she said, looking toward the narrow path that wound back to town. "She wants to go to the mental health center in Boulder. She wants to study, to help kids like her." Walter didn't answer, but in his eyes, there was a smile. Not wide, not bright, but warm like coals that still burned beneath the ash. Ghost stepped out of the cabin and moved toward Becca. He didn't nuzzle her, didn't whimper. He just looked up, as if to say, "You're all right now, and I know it's real this time." Becca knelt, placed her hand on his head. "You should stay," she whispered. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a notebook. Dark brown leather cover, no ribbon, no wrapping. She handed it to Walter. On the first page, written by hand, were the words, "Write down what made you stay. Maybe this time, we'll stay longer." When her car disappeared behind the curve of the forest road, Walter remained on the porch, notebook in hand. The cover was coarse like memory, not new, not heavy, but it smelled of pine wood and beeswax. The scent of days not gone, just waiting. He didn't open it right away. He walked back inside, rekindled the fire, poured more tea, and then sat on the old wooden chair across from Ghost, who lay stretched on the rug. Outside the frosted window, sunlight slanted through the trees, casting a soft halo over Ghost's fur, as if someone was writing a final chapter across his back. Ghost opened his eyes. Walter nodded gently. Then he opened the notebook, took his pen, and wrote the first line, slow, steady, no longer trembling like he had at the start of winter. Day 1, new notebook, not to record what's lost, but to remember why I stayed. There is a white shepherd at my feet. Once they called him by a number. Once they muzzled him, trained him to obey, but he never bowed his head. He survived, and he pulled me back into life with him. Ghost shifted, resting his head on Walter's foot, eyes half closed. Walter placed his hand on the back of his neck, where a faint scar remained like a trace of a former life. But it no longer hurt. It just was. A reminder that things had been worse, and now they didn't need to be perfect. Just enough to keep going. In the cabin, no footsteps were heard walking away. Only the soft scratch of a pen against paper, the crackle of firewood, and the calm breathing of two beings who had once hit rock bottom, now sitting side by side, quietly rewriting what it meant to stay. After the final line was written in the new notebook, Walter closed it and placed it on the windowsill, right where the morning light came in, and where Ghost often lay, silently watching the world. The days that followed passed quietly. No more incidents, no one came knocking, and somehow all of them, man and dog, were learning to live again in a place that had once been merely shelter, but now was beginning to be called home. Walter started repairing the porch roof, replacing rotted boards, and swapping the broken window on the west side for clear glass. He replaced the old wood stove with a red brick hearth and relaid the floor with carefully chosen pine planks from a shop down in town. Ghost never left his side. Whether Walter was sawing boards, mixing cement, or pulling weeds near the old fence, Ghost was always nearby, quietly watchful, never intrusive. He didn't demand attention, didn't hover, but his eyes never strayed, as if saying, "If you stop for even one breath too long, I'll be here." When Walter planted a garden, small lavender bushes, clusters of wild roses, and a young fir tree near the porch, Ghost sat close by, gently sniffing the freshly turned earth, his tail brushing the stone path in slow, quiet rhythm. No one called names, no one gave commands. Yet everything they did seemed perfectly in sync, as if two once lonely beings had learned to understand each other without words. One late afternoon, after the snow had melted and sunlight fell soft across the yard, Walter set a wicker chair on the porch and sat down. Notebook in hand, now nearly 1/3 full. Ghost lay at his feet, head resting on Walter's left shoe, breathing steadily, eyes half closed. Not asleep, just listening, as if the world had slowed down enough to hear itself turning. Walter wrote, Day 28. Today, Ghost helped me stay balanced while fixing the chimney. Not by holding me, just by sitting below, looking up, reminding me, there's no rush. We survived. Now we live. We don't talk much. But every time I glance over, he's already watching. And every time he shifts, I hear his tail brushing the floor, like a sigh that answers without speaking. The cabin no longer felt like it used to. But more importantly, it had begun to breathe again. No more drafts cutting through walls, no more shadows that clung to the corners. Every space now held signs of care, the mark of a human hand, and the trace of a dog who never strayed far from the porch. Ghost had learned to sleep without flinching. Sometimes in deep sleep, he'd whimper softly, legs curling like he was running through some old memory. Walter would place a hand gently on his back, and within seconds, the sound would stop. The breathing would even out. No one forced you to believe in the world again, Walter had said once after a nightmare. But you chose to. I learn that from you every day. Ghost had nudged his head into Walter's hand, not because he understood the words, but because he understood him. One morning, as Walter opened the door to step outside, Ghost ran a few steps ahead, then stopped at the little fir tree. He didn't dig, didn't play. He just stood there, staring at the damp leaves glistening with dew, then turned to look at Walter, eyes deep and calm, as if to say, "This place will grow, just like us." Walter came over, laid his hand on Ghost's head, and exhaled, not from exhaustion, but as if clearing space for peace to stay a little longer. Any place can become home, Walter thought, once the ones inside learn how to look at each other in silence and still hear the breathing. Ghost wagged his tail slightly. Walter smiled. A glance, a tail's flick, a muddy paw print on the step. Each an answer in its quiet way. The last morning of winter arrived like breath-touching skin after a long, dreamless sleep. No warning, no fanfare, just stillness, and the gentle sound of melting snow dripping from the roof, like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. Ghost stood on the porch, no longer cautious like those early days, no longer hesitant like something afraid of losing warmth. He raised his head, took in a long breath, quietly, as if, for the first time, he was smelling damp soil without the taint of metal, feeling wind without the weight of fear. Walter stood beside him, notebook in hand, now nearly full. The corners of the cover had frayed, the spine bore fold marks. The front pages smelled faintly of tea, the middle ones stained with bits of mud and white fur. Like real life, imperfect, messy, but honest in every crease. He sat on the porch step, leaning back against a wooden beam. Ghost lay beside him, warm body pressed to Walter's shin. Morning light filtered diagonally through the thinning branches, casting a soft gold glow on the notebook, like the first sunlight falling into a trench that once held war. Walter turned to the last page. Pen ready. He paused, looked at Ghost, who stared into the distant forest, ears slightly perked, tail resting gently on the porch floor like a soldier no longer on guard, just watching life. And then Walter wrote, each word steady, no longer shaking. Last day of winter. He's not afraid anymore, and neither am I. Maybe love doesn't have to be loud, just lasting long enough to see the snow melt. He never howled, never begged, never asked why the world was cruel. He just stayed, and I learned how to do that. From a dog. He closed the notebook, set it beside a chipped porcelain cup on the windowsill, the same cup Ghost had knocked over the first time he entered the house. It was no longer for drinking. Now it held a few sprigs of pale purple lavender, dried like old memories, preserving a scent that would never fade. Walter looked up. The sky was clearer now. Blue is no longer smothered by gray. No more winds howling, just a wide, quiet sky. Enough to make a man believe the next season might be gentler. Ghost glanced at him. No tail wag, no nod, just eyes, deep, steady, saying nothing more. And Walter understood. Ghost had written his notebook too, not in words, but by staying, by living, by not walking away. That afternoon they walked down the slope together, past pines speckled with sunlight, toward the lake beginning to thaw. No one said a word, but each step echoed on the damp grass like a final period, a quiet close. And if someone had seen them from afar, they would have only seen an old man and a white shepherd walking side by side, slowly, but steadily. No leash, no commands, just the silent promise that neither would turn away unless there was a reason to let go. The story ends, but what remains is not found in the pages, not spoken aloud. It stays between the cabin walls, in paw prints on the porch, and in the look that never strayed across the snow-covered forest. Because sometimes, a dog doesn't come to be rescued. He comes to rescue the part of us we thought we'd lost. The story ends in silence, not because there's nothing left to say, but because the deepest truths are often kept quietly in the heart. Ghost came into the world as an unwanted creature and stayed as a part of what reminds us not to lose ourselves. He wasn't just a dog who survived. He became proof that love, if it's strong enough, can heal what we thought was beyond saving. What about you? Have you ever met a ghost in your life? Someone, human or animal, who stayed just when you were about to fall? If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who might need a little warmth today, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more heartfelt stories about friendship, healing, and unwavering loyalty. We're still here, telling the stories that deserve to be told. Thank you for listening. See you next time.